On May 4, 2017, the tranquility of the Foix Reservoir, in the province of Barcelona, was interrupted by something that did not belong to nature. The reservoir, a place of stagnant waters, winding trails, and absolute silence, became the epicenter of a judicial earthquake. A group of hikers, attracted by a column of thick black smoke rising above the vegetation, ventured down a difficult-to-access forest path. What they found at the end of that trail was not a campfire from campers. It was a car, a mid-range model, reduced to a metal shell deformed by the flames. The smell was the first thing to hit you, an unbearable mixture of molten rubber, synthetic fuel, and, beneath it all, the sweet and unmistakable scent of burnt flesh. When emergency services and the homicide unit of the Mossos d'Esquadra arrived at the scene, the discovery confirmed their worst suspicions. In the driver's seat, or what remained of it, lay the charred remains of a human being. It was not a homeless person, nor was it just any settling of scores in the world of common crime. That body, burned beyond recognition, belonged to Pedro Rodríguez, an officer of the Barcelona Guardia Urbana. The question that resonated in the instructor's office was not who, but why. Why would a police officer, a figure representing authority, end up as a ruin in a remote spot? At that moment, the investigation became a dark mirror. The police were investigating a police officer, but not just any officer. They were investigating a man who, until 24 hours earlier, had been dining, laughing, and sharing his life with other officers who, coincidentally, held the same rank and worked at the same station. The Foix Reservoir was not chosen at random. Its geographic location, a dead point between Barcelona and Tarragona, suggested calculated planning. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, a site where if someone wanted to hide a truth, the terrain itself seemed willing to collaborate. But what the perpetrators did not take into account was the precision of modern technology. Mobile phones, those devices we carry glued to our skin like an extension of our identity, began to tell a story that did not match the official version that was beginning to spill from the lips of the suspects. At this point, the narrative cannot be linear. We must understand that this case was a game of chess played in real time. On one side, a woman, Rosa Peral, whose capacity for seduction and manipulation had been the center of a storm of rumors in her workplace. On the other, a man, Albert López, an officer with an excessive obsession for discipline, strength, and, above all, for Rosa. Between them, a third vertex, Pedro, a man who, without knowing it, had become the obstacle to a plan that, in the minds of his aggressors, seemed perfect. The next few hours of investigation revealed a web of lies so complex that, even for the most seasoned Mossos investigators, it was difficult to separate reality from fiction. While Pedro's body was still cooling in the Institute of Legal Medicine, at the police stations in Barcelona, the tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Everyone was watching each other. Everyone was suspicious. And yet, the game of appearances had to continue. The facade of camaraderie remained intact, while, beneath the surface, a silent war of betrayals was about to explode. Welcome to the definitive analysis of the Guardia Urbana crime. Do not look for heroes. Here, the law was the weapon, the body was the evidence, and the lie was the shield. We are going to unearth, layer by layer, what really happened in those 48 hours where loyalty turned to ashes. To understand why Pedro Rodríguez ended up charred in the Foix Reservoir, we must first strip them bare. They were not common civilians. They were law enforcement officers. The Barcelona Guardia Urbana is a force governed by a strict hierarchy, locker room camaraderie, and a culture where the line between professional and private life often becomes dangerously blurred. Pedro Rodríguez, the victim, was a man who, according to those close to him, sought stability. But in his search for affection, he fell into the epicenter of an emotional black hole, Rosa Peral. Rosa was not just another officer. Within the force, her name was synonymous with controversy, seduction, and an almost supernatural ability to maneuver as she pleased in interpersonal relationships. Rosa Peral possessed a tactical intelligence applied to relationships. Witnesses in the trial would describe years later how she used information as a bargaining chip and sexuality as a tool of power. But Pedro, perhaps blinded by the intensity of the romance, did not see the web being woven around him. Rosa already had someone else on her board, Albert López. Albert was the counterpoint. If Rosa was the strategist, Albert was the enforcer, the man who lived under military discipline and who felt a quasi-pathological devotion to her. Albert was not just a lover. He was her accomplice, her shadow, the man willing to burn his own career, and his soul for a sign from her. The dynamic between the three was a powder keg. Pedro represented the threat to Rosa's control. Pedro was beginning to see behind the mask. He was beginning to understand that the woman he was in love with harbored secrets that not even a police officer should know. In the weeks leading up to May 4th, the atmosphere in Rosa's house in Vilanova i la Geltrú was not that of a home. It was that of a theater stage where every gesture, every message, and every silence was being choreographed. Analyzing Rosa's psychology is entering a terrain where truth is the first hostage. During the process, experts spoke of narcissistic traits, of a compulsive need to be the center of the narrative. But for us, here, the important thing is to understand how that psychology infected Albert. Albert López, an officer with a history of violence and control, was seduced by Rosa's promise of exclusivity. For him, eliminating Pedro was not an act of justice, it was a way to restore order to his private world. The question that hangs in the air is, who manipulated whom? Was it Rosa who dictated Pedro's death sentence, or was it Albert who, driven by his own demons, decided that Pedro had to disappear? The reality, as we will see in the block on the night of the events, is that both likely fed off each other in a spiral of violence where the authority they carried on their badges became the perfect weapon to attempt the perfect crime. Pedro, meanwhile, was living his life. He was a man with plans, with a future, unaware that the colleague who patrolled the streets with him and the woman who slept by his side were, literally, drawing a line of no return. The Barcelona Guardia Urbana, an institution designed to protect citizens, harbored within its ranks two people who were about to cross the border into barbarism. This block is not just about a love triangle. It is about dehumanization. When you feel above the law, because you are the law, the life of another human being begins to be seen as just another piece in a chess game. Rosa and Albert believed they were untouchable. They believed they were smarter than the homicide investigators who, at that moment, still did not know they would have to confront their own colleagues. How was that night orchestrated? How did they manage to deceive everyone, even their families, before the black smoke rose from the reservoir? In the next block, we will reconstruct the timeline of the night of May 1st to 2nd, minute by minute, using the data from the mobile phones that finally condemned them. The night of May 1st to 2nd, 2017, was not a night of improvisation. It was a cold, calculated choreography, and ultimately betrayed by the digital footprint that is impossible to erase nowadays. While the city of Barcelona slept, in the house in Vilanova i la Geltrú where Rosa Peral lived with her daughters, the end of Pedro Rodríguez' life was being written. The technical reconstruction of the events, based on mobile phone cell tower positioning and the records of the suspects' handsets, reveals a reality that refutes Rosa and Albert's initial statements point by point. During the afternoon of May 1st, the suspects' movements were erratic, a deliberate attempt to build a solid alibi. Albert López, according to the evidence presented at trial, traveled to the vicinity of Rosa's house in Vilanova. His phone connected to a cell tower near the address, but he was not there for a casual visit. The WhatsApp messages exchanged between them during the previous days reveal planning that oscillated between contempt for Pedro and the determination to eliminate him. "There is no turning back now," was one of the phrases that would resonate in the courtroom months later. Around midnight, Pedro Rodríguez was murdered inside the home. The violence was extreme. Forensic experts, months later, would find themselves facing a scene where cleaning attempts tried to hide the brutality. Traces of blood in strategic points, moved furniture, and an atmosphere permeated with a forced calm. According to the version that investigators pieced together, Pedro's body did not leave the house until hours later. While Pedro's corpse remained hidden, Rosa and Albert's mobiles began their journey south. This is where technology becomes the queen of evidence. Pedro Rodríguez's phone was transported from Vilanova i la Geltrú to the Foix Reservoir. The cell tower tracked the exact route. Rosa Peral's and Albert López's phones followed the same path, like a digital shadow that could not detach itself from the car transporting the body. At several points during the early hours, Rosa and Albert's phones turned off simultaneously. It was not a technical coincidence. It was a conscious decision. When they turned back on, the devices re-registered on the same cell towers, confirming they were together at the place where the car was incinerated. Upon reaching the Foix Reservoir, around 3 a.m., the scene became hellish. The car was doused with fuel and set on fire. The heat was such that the vehicle's structure was reduced to an unrecoverable metal shell. The perpetrators believed the fire would erase all traces of DNA, all signs of their presence. But what they could not burn was the invisible footprint. The fact that their mobiles, while searching for signal in such a remote and wooded area, shouted to the cell towers exactly where they were. While the flames devoured the car and Pedro's body, Rosa and Albert returned to their lives. They returned to their posts in the Guardia Urbana, put on their uniforms, and patrolled the same streets they had watched over with Pedro weeks earlier. The coldness of this act is what, for many, defines the true nature of the crime. There was no immediate remorse. There was a cold management of time and public image. During the following days, Rosa Peral used Pedro's phone to send messages to his contacts, attempting to simulate that he was still alive, that he had simply left, that he had decided to disappear after an argument. It was a production worthy of a film noir script, but with a basic technical flaw. The Mossos d'Esquadra investigators were no longer looking for a missing man, but were analyzing a digital trail that, with every message sent from Pedro's mobile, became more suspicious. Contradictions began to appear almost immediately. Rosa said one thing to her colleagues, Albert told another version to his. But who said what? The clash between the two suspects' versions would become the next major scenario of this tragedy, a game of accusations where each one tried to shift the blame onto the other, forgetting that both were trapped in the same circle of evidence. As the hours passed and the Mossos d'Esquadra began to compile the puzzle of evidence, the apparent alliance between Rosa Peral and Albert López began to crack. The police did not take long to realize that the united front they presented to the media and their superiors was, in reality, a time bomb about to explode. In the interrogation room, the atmosphere was suffocating. For the first time in the recent history of the Guardia Urbana, officers were not interrogating a common criminal, but two of their own. Investigators used a classic but devastating technique: isolation. By separating Rosa and Albert, detectives began to introduce small contradictions between their accounts. Rosa Peral adopted a defensive stance that soon became offensive. Her narrative was clear: she was another victim of Albert's violence. According to her, Albert had appeared at her home in Villanova, had burst into her life, and in an act of uncontrollable jealousy, had murdered Pedro. Rosa presented herself as a terrified woman, someone who could not report it because the fear of reprisals from a violent police officer paralyzed her. However, this version clashed violently with technical reality. How to explain, then, the WhatsApp messages she herself sent? How to explain that she was present, or at least aware, of the vehicle's movements toward the reservoir? For investigators, Rosa Peral's victim version was a house of cards that collapsed with each cell tower record. Albert López, for his part, attempted a different tactic, though equally charged with cynicism. He did not present himself as a victim, but as a man trapped in a web of manipulation. According to his account, it was Rosa who, with icy coldness, planned Pedro's murder. He admitted to being present at the reservoir, to having helped dispose of the body, but always under Rosa's emotional coercion. According to Albert, he only wanted to please her, regain control of their relationship, and, ultimately, it was she who dragged him into the abyss. The clash was brutal. During the trial, this war of versions reached levels of high dramatic tension. Both pointed to each other as the material author of the murder. It was a judicial spectacle where the goal was not the truth, but the most effective survival strategy. This is where technology, once again, dismantled the arguments. The analysis of bloodstains in the home revealed that the cleaning was too professional. It was not the cleaning of someone acting in a panic attack, but of someone who knows how a crime scene works and how to attempt to erase traces. What made this block of the investigation so impactful was discovering how they treated each other after the crime. There was no love, no loyalty. There was a pragmatic management of the crime. Audio and statements were leaked where both attempted to prepare their children or close relatives to maintain alibis that, by then, were already being destroyed by the objective data from the Mossos. Forensic investigation was the final blow. Experts in ballistics, toxicology, and DNA analysis found clues in Rosa's house that did not fit the story of Albert's violent intrusion. The house did not look like a place where someone had entered by force, but a place where a controlled execution had occurred. As the trial progressed, Rosa Peral's figure began to eclipse everything. Her attitude in court, sometimes defiant, sometimes emotional, always calculated, generated a national debate about her psychological profile. Was she a real-life femme fatale, or simply a person with extraordinary manipulative capacity? For the jurors, the answer did not matter as much as the irrefutable fact. Pedro Rodríguez had died, and his two partners, the official one and the lover, were the only ones who could have executed the plan. This block is crucial to understand the corruption of loyalty. Two police officers, trained to serve and protect, had turned their training into a tool of concealment. When the law investigated its own members, the system proved that, although the process is slow and painful, the truth has a way of emerging through digital data and biological residues that no lie can cover up. The trial, held at the Barcelona court in 2020, was not just a criminal proceeding. It was a public dissection of the morality of two law enforcement officers. For weeks, the courtroom became a stage where each witness, each expert, and each piece of evidence presented added another layer of horror to what we already knew. The jury, tasked with deciding Rosa and Albert's fate, faced a monumental task: navigating through a sea of lies. The defense strategies were those of mutual self-destruction. While Rosa's lawyers attempted to present her as a woman cornered by a dangerous man, Albert's counsel constructed the portrait of a man who, driven by blind love, was induced to commit an atrocious crime by a woman whose capacity for manipulation knew no bounds. The final verdict was resounding and marked a milestone in the Spanish justice system. Rosa Peral was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder of Pedro Rodríguez with treachery. Albert López, for his part, received a 20-year sentence. The difference in the sentence was not trivial. The court considered that Rosa, as Pedro's sentimental partner, had committed a crime of murder with the aggravating factor of kinship, a factor that raises criminal responsibility and underscores the absolute betrayal of the trust placed in her. The sentence did not only punish the murder, it punished the brutality of the method. The court was explicit in its legal grounds. The accused did not only kill, but meticulously planned how to dispose of the body, attempting to erase the victim's very existence through fire. This level of disregard for human life, aggravated by the fact that both were police officers, was what sealed their fate. For criminal law experts, this case is studied as an example of what happens when social control mechanisms fail. How is it possible that two officers, trained in crime detection, made such basic errors? The answer, as discussed in academic presentations following the trial, lies in overconfidence. Rosa and Albert believed they were smarter than the system to which they belonged. They thought that, by knowing the Mossos protocols, they could deceive their own colleagues. But they underestimated the capacity of modern forensic science to reconstruct the truth from digital data. Rosa Peral's image during the trial, sometimes impassive, sometimes breaking down in tears before television cameras, became an icon of true crime culture in Spain. But beyond the media spectacle, what became clear is that justice could break the wall of silence they themselves tried to erect. The Guardia Urbana case does not close with a prison sentence. Its true legacy is the devastating impact on the police institution and society. Public trust, the fundamental pillar upon which any security force rests, was seriously damaged. Who watches the watchmen when they themselves are the ones crossing the line? The Barcelona Guardia Urbana had to face a deep restructuring of its internal oversight protocols. The revelation that two of its members could maintain a parallel, toxic, and violent relationship without their superiors detecting the risk highlighted structural failures in human resources management. But above all, this case leaves us a painful lesson. Evil does not always manifest as a stranger jumping from the shadows. Sometimes, evil wears a uniform, smiles at company dinners, and patrols the streets you travel every day. The disappearance and murder of Pedro Rodríguez is the constant reminder that gender violence and psychological manipulation do not understand rank, salary, or social status. Pedro, beyond being the victim of a media case, was a man who, ultimately, was betrayed by the two people to whom he gave his trust. And although 20 or 25 years in prison may seem like a high figure to some, for Pedro's family, the true sentence is the absence. Because, unlike other cases where justice arrives late or incompletely, here the sentence was clear, but the wound left by the fact that the crime was perpetrated by colleagues is a scar that does not close even with the passage of decades. If the Guardia Urbana case teaches us anything, it is that evil rarely arrives accompanied by tense music or nightmare scenarios. Often, horror dresses in everyday life. Rosa Peral and Albert López were not movie monsters. They were people who drank coffee at the same machine as their colleagues, who commented on the soccer match, and who, at the end of their shift, took off their uniforms to hide a reality that no citizen would have imagined seeing them pass by in a patrol car. Upon closing this case, we must ask ourselves, what is it that really terrifies us? Is it the murder itself, or the human capacity to fragment reality to justify the unjustifiable? Justice has passed sentence, cells have been locked, and Rosa and Albert's names have become part of Spain's criminal history. But the collateral damage of this crime is an echo that does not fade. Public trust in police institutions is an extremely thin glass. Once it is broken, even if it is glued back together, the scars remain visible forever. Pedro Rodríguez's story does not end with the condemnation of his executioners. It lives in every unanswered question, in every conversation about professional ethics, and in the painful lesson that, sometimes, those who swear to protect us can be the ones who cause the most harm. This documentary has not just been a reconstruction of a criminal act. It has been a journey through the darkest corners of the human psyche, where love turns into obsession and power into a weapon of destruction. Today, while we reflect on these events, I invite you to think about the fragility of our certainties. In a world where everything seems to be under control, the secrets kept by the people around us can be unfathomable abysses. Thank you for joining me in this dissection of the truth. Remembering this case is not feeding morbid curiosity. It is keeping alive the need for vigilance, for integrity, and above all, never forgetting that justice, although sometimes late, is the only tool we have to bring order to the chaos provoked by those who decide to cross the red line of humanity.